This presentation, Framing Modern Monetary Theory, is based upon a paper written by Louisa and myself, and it was presented at the Path to Full Employment Conference in Newcastle, New South Wales on December 2013. We start off by noting that macroeconomic concepts are constantly paraded in the media. They make headlines almost every day. But the problem is that these concepts are in themselves very difficult. Students struggle with macroeconomic concepts much more than they do microeconomic concepts. And ultimately, they're not well understood in the public. Social media also exacerbates this problem. Out in the blogosphere, there's all number of experts, so-called, who engage in very vigorous debates about macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic theory, and quite often there's no correspondence to what the concepts actually mean in these debates. And overarching all of that is the fact that there are ideological agendas which frame the debate. And they exploit the difficulty of the concepts and the fact that they're not popularly comprehended, and they abuse the concepts to advance the ideological agenda. The way they frame the debate is abusive to the meaning and intent of the concepts. And our hypothesis is that the success of the neoliberal agenda is down to the way it frames and the debate and the way it uses language, rather than its evidence base, which on any basis is a failure. And the corollary of that, of course, is that modern monetary theory, we believe, is a coherent, progressive alternative that's internally consistent and empirically robust, but it fails to cut through. And it's failed to cut through principally because there is an incomplete understanding of key macroeconomic terms, and that the terms are framed by the orthodoxy, the neoliberal paradigm, in such a way that the public are unable to determine when a proposition that they're accepting actually undermines their well-being. And what we argue is that language can constrain our thinking, and in this context, we examine some of the key metaphors used to reinforce the flawed message of orthodox economics. And later in the presentation and in the paper, we propose effective ways of advancing MMT ideas in a progressive way. Two visions of the economy. This is taken from Shenko Azorio's book, which is referenced in the paper. Don't buy it. This model is the representation of the dominant paradigm. It's what we call the individualistic or natural world. It conceives of the economy as standing as a living entity which is self-governing and natural, and a deity that's removed from us, and the people and the planet are there to serve the deity. And we do this by having faith, confidence. We have to work hard, we have to make sacrifices for the good of the economy. And if there's anyone who's falling by the wayside, the poor or the unemployed, they're considered to be miscreants in the way that they haven't sacrificed enough for the economy, they haven't worked hard enough for the economy. And the economy can get sick if we interfere with its competitive, self-regulating operations, which, if left alone, will maximise wealth. And the way we consider success or failure is in terms of real GDP growth, for example, irrespective of the air quality, happiness, well-being and other measures that might be attributable to the people and the planet. And one of the galling aspects of the dominant paradigm is that progressives get caught up in this way of thinking and way of representation, and they get locked into just proposing fairer alternatives to current policy. So in terms of fiscal austerity, they propose things like more gradual austerity rather than rejecting this entire vision of the economy. The second vision is what we consider to be the basis for a progressive alternative. It sees that the people and the planet are organically linked. People are embedded in nature. The well-being of the people and the well-being of the planet are intrinsically linked, and that the economy, which is constructed by us, we've created it, is there to serve us. There's nothing natural about it. We've created this economy, we control it, we can regulate it, and we need to use its capacity to advance the well-being of us and the planet rather than considering it to be some deity. And in this context, the government becomes our agent to do things that we can either not do at all or can't do as well individually. It's certainly not a moral arbiter punishing us or anybody who doesn't sacrifice enough. It's there to introduce policies, to pursue policies that advance, economic policies that advance the well-being of the people and the planet. And policies should be functional in that sense. You know, this is Abba Lerner's functional finance idea, that we only consider whether a policy is good or bad by whether it's advancing our sense of socio-economic purpose. And at the centre of the economic debate has to be the people and the planet, not the economy. The economy is there to serve us. In the next few slides, I discuss some of the principal findings of cognitive linguistics and cognitive philosophy. And this stems from work from my co-author, Louisa. And this literature and approach to language and cognition helps us to understand why it's difficult to challenge orthodox views. And as the slide shows, there's three basic principles that are of relevance in relation to cognitive linguistics. The idea of the embodied mind, the idea that thought is mostly unconscious. There's no formal thinking in the sense that it's logical, and we observe continually in people's lives that they hold inconsistent views without being aware of it. And importantly, the third basic principle is this notion that abstract concepts, the way we learn and think and understand abstract concepts is through metaphorical links. And this is relating back to the embodied mind, where we link sensio-motor concepts with these abstract theoretical domains. Another important concept from this literature is the notion of construal, and that this relates to the idea that orthodox economics uses language that deploys primary metaphors that reinforce underlying assumptions which are largely incorrect. But if we understand the way in which the human mind works, then it becomes apparent that if we use terms of like a government deficit, it's counterintuitive for us, given the underlying metaphors, for us to consider a deficit to be desirable. In a very basic sense, we consider metaphors associated with less bad, down and unhappy, and more good, up, happy, for example. So a deficit we consider to be bad, so a greater deficit makes us unhappy and it's not good. The important thing that comes out of this literature is that we do have the capacity to construe the same information before us, a change in a budget deficit for a government, in a different way. And the task of progressive economics is to exploit that capacity to change construal and promote a better understanding of policy options. And that's more or less what the paper is moving towards. What we argue is that mainstream macroeconomics is a degenerative research program in the Lakatosian sense. That is, it fails to predict any novel facts, and the exemplary example of that is the global financial crisis, which completely evaded the formal models of the mainstream macroeconomics. And so, even though it's a degenerative program, it remains dominant because it exploits these linked myths that are then reinforced by strong metaphors and associated language. And so we consider some of the popular ones in the table 1 in the paper, and you'll read these almost every day or hear them on the radio. Living beyond our means is something to do with sacrifice needed or excesses, and spending like a drunken sailor. You know, governments are spending like a drunken sailor. They're wanton and irresponsible and delinquent. Or we've got a budget black hole, that there's some sort of collapse going on of the analogy there being astronomical, and so on and so forth. Bankruptcy, debt mountains, huge burdens, run out of money, ballooning out of control, and so on and so forth. And what these metaphors do is reinforce a series of propositions promoted by mainstream economists and their conservative commentariat that focus their attack on government intervention. And one of the things we note is that progressives get locked into debating with in this metaphorical space, and they argue, oh well, it's realpolitik. The way in which the conservatives talk is reflecting the politics of the situation, and so if we move outside of that space, we'll just be disregarded because it will be considered to be politically unrealistic, our options advanced. And well, I guess our view of that is that it's up to the progressives to alter the metaphorical space so that we redefine what is politically feasible or not, rather than getting locked in to essentially reinforcing the conservative metaphorical space by being constrained by its ambit. The paper then goes on to present several mainstream neoclassical macroeconomic propositions and provides relatively detailed modern monetary theory response. So, for example, governments face the same budget constraint as a household. That's a central underlying textbook proposition that students get confronted. In the metaphorical space, it's, government will run out of money just like a household has to control its budget, so should a government. Well, the textbook says that there's a government budget constraint. And modern monetary theory tells us quite clearly that the household budget analysis is inapplicable. Households use a currency that the government issues, that our own personal budget experience generates no knowledge relevant to the consideration of government matters, and so on and so forth. Budget deficits are bad, budget surpluses are good. Well, those statements are meaningless, sometimes because they have to be placed within a context of the appropriateness of the fiscal position relative to the spending and saving plans of the external sector and the private domestic sector. Sometimes a budget deficit will be appropriate, and other times a budget surplus will be appropriate. Generally, concepts like budget surpluses contribute to national savings. Well, no, they don't. Budget surpluses destroy non-government wealth and deficits increase non-government wealth. And so on and so forth. There's 10 propositions that the paper considers. The government will run out of fiscal space, money. Well, modern monetary theory tells you that fiscal space is not defined in terms of some given financial ratio. It's defined to the extent that there are available real resources that the government is able to utilise. So where we're at is that we believe that modern monetary theory has got effective theoretical and conceptual counters that refute all of the myths that underpin mainstream neoclassical macroeconomics. It's internally consistent. MMT can predict novel facts. Certainly the proponents of modern monetary theory were foreshadowing the financial crisis a decade before it occurred. The problem is, though, that the MMT concepts challenge the way that humans currently think about macroeconomic concepts, and that thinking has been driven by the superior use of metaphors and language by the neoliberal paradigm. And the task we face is that a progressive macroeconomic narrative based upon MMT concepts needs to overcome that challenge that humans have in thinking about macroeconomic concepts. Now, where we start establishing a strategy, if you like, is that we need to establish a progressive purpose. The argument can never start with the facts. I think we've won the facts war. I think MMT has a superior understanding of the facts. The starting point, however, has to be more general than that and relate to social purpose and aspirations. What do we want in terms of the second vision of the economy, the diagram that I displayed earlier? We need to ask, what do we want the economy to do for us? And this is a reversal of the idea that if the government as our agent interferes with the natural state, the economy will get sick. Rather, we need to emphasise that the government is our controlling agent to ensure that once we've set the purposes that we want to achieve, that the economy is moving in that direction. And so the initial effort a progressive agenda has to engage in is defining the social purpose of government policy. That should be articulated and narrated in ways which resonate and activate intrinsic frames in our brains. The articulation of facts about operational reality, etc., can come after that. As an example, the Centre for Employment and Equity had some dealings with the New Zealand Mayor's Task Force, which was a very creative venture by the local government mayors in New Zealand to do something about youth unemployment in their local government areas. And they had such broad aims as zero waste of New Zealanders, or more recently, our youth, our future. These are statements of purpose that resonate with our intrinsic frames and create a collective vision that bring us together. And so that should be the starting point. But the other point to note is that these broad goals can't just be simply motherhood statements. They have to be associated with concrete actions. We need to invoke what are called event causation structures and link these to metaphors. For example, we might have as a social vision jobs for all. And of course, that's a desirable objective, and almost anybody would agree with that. while that's a desirable and objective that everybody would agree with, it has no action statement to it. So it could be easily followed by the statement or the slogan, free markets will grow the economy and create jobs. Well, there's no action statement there either, but that type of statement is strongly reinforcing the metaphors, the anti-government intervention metaphors that the dominant paradigm uses. So progressives have to add an appropriate action to that. So we might want jobs for all, but then say immediately that means that aggregate demand has to rise by X% to generate Y million jobs. So we've got an action following the jobs for all social purpose statement. We've actually got an action that's got some concrete dimensions, and that action statement that follows then immediately raises questions about, well, who's responsible for aggregate demand has to rise? How does that happen? And so you get the event jobs for all, the causation structure that has to happen through government deficits. And so you get this linked series of statements that start off with a purpose, create an event, define some causation, which then forces an action. So we see the challenge in two parts. One is to better educate the public regarding macroeconomics, and that's what I do in my professional role every day. But I now know that that's not enough. That I think we've got superior models of the economy, but the second part of the challenge is we need to develop a language that appeals to the intrinsic frames that we use to understand things and then connects people with the economy rather than reinforce the figure one vision that I showed earlier. So how to frame the debate, we have to have an understanding of metaphors, and we have to have a discussion and some thinking about what language we're going to use. Okay, so the bolded statements are what Lakoff and Johnson call primary metaphors. So, for example, this is just teasing out some ideas. Purposes are destinations. So we intrinsically want to achieve purposes, and we define success when we reach a specific destination. So we need to make sure that we define the destination as an inclusive people concept rather than something to do with an independent economy. So instead of getting bogged down in discussions about financial ratios or size of deficits, whatever, we need to be talking about destinations that we want to achieve as people. Another primary metaphor, purposes are desired objects. And again, we want to avoid getting locked into debates about financial ratios. They just reinforce the frames about sacrifice and rectitude and hard work, etc. We always want to point to desired objects that relate directly to our intrinsic frames. So, for example, when we're using language, we need to be very careful on what metaphors the language trigger. So, for example, government spent X million dollars. The concept of spending invokes a notion of it's gone, it's wasted. Government spent all this money, it's gone, and what have we got to show for it? Alternatively, we can say government invested X million dollars to enhance our purposes. Note the difference, we're using invest instead of spent. And this is exploiting the primary metaphor more is up, which is one of the basic metaphors. And so we're using investment, building up, rather than using up, spent. And when we say the government budget deficit is X% of GDP, there's 2 points to note. One is that the more is up metaphor works in reverse, so a deficit is bad, so if it goes up, that's a bad outcome and invokes negative reactions. And the second thing is the use of the language term budget triggers the household metaphor. And so we're back into reinforcing the conservative view of the government budget, that it's a household budget that needs to be constrained. What the literature also indicates is that we can exploit the more is up metaphor, for example, using an appropriate event structure metaphor, which links more is up with purposes of destinations, for example. And here the destination has to be prominent. So we might say the government deficit rose and generated higher levels of wealth for households and firms. And so we're linking the more is up with a destination and a purpose, that it's the government deficit rising is moving us towards higher wealth for the private sector firms and households. And this reinforces the concept of forced movement, which is a way we understand metaphorical statements. Nothing would have happened unless, so we wouldn't have become wealthy unless the government deficit rose. And so we're linking what is previously a more is up metaphorical negative to a forced movement which yields a positive response. So some other primary metaphors: causes are forces and causation is forced. So we've been talking about action statements. Here we want to disabuse the person who we're talking to of the natural event causation. That is, that somehow if the government leaves the economy alone, the economy will just do its own thing to create maximum wealth. Well, in this case, we want to disabuse that notion and introduce the notion that government action will force movement towards the desired destination, and with that force, without that force, there's no movement and no goal achievement. So there's a typo there, sorry about that. So in conclusion, that's just a small insight into where this research program's going. We aim to produce by perhaps the end of next year a handbook of progressive language and argument. The aim of that exercise is to undermine the ideological hold that mainstream economics has, and we're not aiming to produce a better fact correspondence. I think we've already got that, or more logical propositions. I think modern monetary theory we've done a lot of work in that regard, and I think we've won that war. What we aim to achieve now is to reinforce that superior conceptual basis of the way in which the monetary system works by producing a smarter use of metaphors and language. Thanks very much.